Mark Gordon, are you online?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome to our Keep It Public conference call.
Wonderful. And who is this?
My name is Earl DeGroot, and I will be the moderator.
Great, Earl. Thank you.
You bet. Today we have a special guest, Mark Gordon, Republican candidate for governor. And I'd like to welcome him and everybody else to the call. And we have a bunch of people on the line, so let's quickly do some introductions. So that everybody doesn't speak at once, let's do this county by county. If you live in counties 1 through 5, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Larry Durante up in Sheridan County.
Rob Davidson, Counsel for the Bighorn Range, Sheridan County.
Kale Centurino, Wyoming Wilderness Association, Sheridan County.
Shannon Anderson with Powder River Basin Resource Council in Sheridan.
Rob Joyce with the Wyoming Chapter of the Sierra Club in Laramie.
Anybody else, 1 through 5?
Yeah. Jeff Muratori, Wyoming Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Casper.
Okay, if you live in counties 6 through 10, please introduce yourself.
Jesse Johnson, Wyoming Wildlife Federation.
And Derek Farmer, Wyoming Hunters and Anglers Alliance.
Anybody else 6 through 10?
Yep, Steph Kessler, Wyoming Outdoor Council.
How about Aaron? Is he on the line?
No.
Apparently not. If you live in counties 11 through 15, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, this is Warren Murphy from the Wyoming Interfaith Network.
Jenny DeCero with Greater Yellowstone Coalition in Park County.
Can you repeat that, please? Sorry.
Jenny with Greater Yellowstone Coalition in Park County.
Thank you.
Anybody else in counties 11 through 15? If you live in counties 16 through 23, please introduce yourself. Anybody else on the call?
I just got on County 5, Laramie, Sally Palmer for the Wyoming Interfaith Network.
Okay. How about Nate Martin? Is he on the call? Well, hopefully he'll join us in a little bit here. Well, welcome everyone. And Steph Kessler from the Wyoming Outdoor Council is going to tell us a little bit about the history of the Keep It Public Coalition.
Thanks, Mark, for joining the call. The Keep It Public Coalition is a broad and diverse, loosely knit association of groups, businesses, and individuals that share the common value of support for our public lands. We are comprised of over 40 NGOs and thousands of individuals and businesses in the state of Wyoming. We were founded in 2016, about 2 years ago, and our first event that launched the organization was a big rally in Casper, where we recruited about 400 folks to attend. And the group, I guess what unites us is that we are opposed to the transfer of federal lands to the state. Since our original rally in Casper, we've had other public events in about 4 or 5 Wyoming communities, and we connect on a semi-regular basis via conference calls like this one, and most of our work is focused on the state legislature.
Okay, thank you, Steph. I heard a couple dings. Did somebody just join the call?
Hi, Earl. This is Aaron Pannon from Knowles, National Outdoor Leadership School.
Welcome. Okay, people are here to ask questions, so let's get started. The first question is from Jesse Johnson with the Wyoming Wildlife Federation. Jesse?
Yes, thank you again, Mark, for hopping on this call with us. And mine's fairly straightforward. It's a couple-parted question, but basically, what is your position on federal land transfer? Do you support small pilot project type transfers? And do you support the transfer of federal land mineral management to the state?
Okay. First off, as I've stated over and over again, I think it doesn't make sense for federal lands transfer. There is a statement way back when, which was they highlighted a piece and my full narrative was something along the lines of, look, if people are willing to go try to fight this issue in Washington, have at it, that's fine. But they picked out a piece and said I was in favor of federal lands transfer. I think it's a fool's mission because our Constitution in, Article 21, or maybe it's, I can't remember where it is, but anyway, we forever gave up those lands. Our active admission required that of us, and so on that note alone, it doesn't make sense, and then I would oppose it anyway because we need to have access to those federal lands. There are some isolated 40s and 80s and so on that may make sense for transfer under basically the disposal elements of the Taylor Grazing Act, but that should be on a case-by-case basis, and it would be only for, if it made sense and there wasn't otherwise access to those parcels. So as far as federal mineral management is concerned, I believe that probably also is challenged under the constitutional requirements. However, I do believe that it would be important for the state to have primacy, as we do in many of the other environmental laws, and that's something that I would like to have more local accountability on that issue.
Thank you so much for that. Again, we appreciate you hopping on here with us. I would say on to the next question.
All right.
Thank you,
the next question is from Nate Martin, but I'm not sure he's on the line. Nate, are you here? Let me go ahead and ask the question for him. It's, what role do you see public lands playing in diversifying Wyoming's economy beyond mineral extraction in the next 20 years?
I see the lands playing an incredibly crucial role in developing our outdoor industries. Be that mountaineering, as I've done my whole life, or mountain biking in those areas, those kinds of things. I believe very strongly that public lands and our ability to promote the access and use of those lands is incredibly important.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question is from Shannon Anderson of the Powder River Basin Resource Council.
Thanks, Earl, and thanks, Mark, for being on the phone with us today. What do you view is the role of the Wyoming governor in terms of weighing in on federal oil and gas leasing and other federal issues impacting public lands and minerals? So basically, how do you see, if elected, your role as the governor in interacting with our federal partners?
Well, thanks, Shannon. I guess I think the governor should have a very strong role, particularly under the FLIPMA provisions. And one of the things that I've spoken about in our primary and now also in the general is being able to arm the governor with more tools to be able to work under the FLPMA provisions allowing for consultation and coordination. I think local control is very important, and it should be guided, I suppose, by federal statutes and all that. But I really do think the governor plays an incredibly strong role, and I would like to pursue increasing that role in whatever way we can to make sure that Wyoming has more authority over how its lands are managed.
Okay, thank you for that. And the next question is from Reverend Warren Murphy with the Wyoming Interfaith Network. Warren, are you on the line?
Sure am. Ready to go. Yes, Mark. As you probably know, the Interfaith Network is very big on preserving the sacredness of the Red Desert. We, along with many other groups that have been working on preserving the Red Desert, see it as an important scenic and recreational landscape for guides, outfitters, hunters, hikers, and other recreational activities, as well as culturally, spiritually, and historically significant for Wyoming's tribes, both Arapaho and Shoshone, the faith community, which is us especially, and our nation's western expansion area. And so what is your level of support for oil and gas drilling in this landscape, including the wilderness study areas that are there?
So Warren, thank you. Let me back up for just a second. When I was chair of the EQC, I was suggesting, and it was kind of from Tom Strook's also suggestions, that we look carefully at the Red Desert for areas of rare and critically uncommon landscapes and look towards making some designations there. I was very upset that the EQC decided to go as far as they did because I feared that there would be a backlash, and so there has been. And I think one of the sad things about that is that the legislature, within a year's time, ended up weakening the Environmental Qualities Council to be able to recognize those areas. I worry about the wilderness study areas in the same sense. I think it's very important that the county efforts go forward and they have the discussions that they do and make the recommendations that they do. And if those lands are recommended to be released, then the county commissioners, go ahead and do that as well. Then I think as governor, you would have to think about that very carefully going forward. But on the other hand, where those areas are designated and where there is movement towards resolving that, I think that I think those areas can be protected. And I think it's also valuable these days, now that there are advanced drilling techniques, to try to find ways to accommodate multiple uses by making it smaller, sort of the footprint of the drilling, trying to work with oil and gas regulations and with the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to see if we can accommodate alternative ways of developing these minerals, because currently we have fairly straightforward mechanisms that are really designed around efficiency rather than respecting things like corridors and so on. But generally speaking, about the Red Desert landscape, it's a beautiful place. It's a spiritual place, as you say, and I think that we should work collaboratively to find ways to be able to accommodate the multiple important issues that are associated there. And I think that means that we have to look, and that's why I started with the EQC discussion, because that conversation really could have allowed for a more careful consideration of the value of certain of ways of staging the development, ways of looking at development over time in places that development should or should not occur. And And I think, and you probably all knew that under the prior, the way the law was written, it had very little impact on oil and gas development, but it was a way of designating some of these areas to be more sensitive about them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Warren, for that question. The next question is from Jeff Murder with the Wyoming Backcountry Hunters and Anglers.
Thank you, Mark, for being here with us. I have this question and a follow-up. Do you support, and if so, what ideas would you have on improving recreational access to landlocked federal and state trust lands?
Okay. State trust land, let's deal with that first. Our obligation, as you know, is to maximize revenues to the state. Where we can achieve access to those lands, we should. We should do that in a way that respects private property. And we should work with landowners, I think, to try to make sure that people, if they have access, do respect both private property and the management options that are out there on the public lands. And it's a terrible thing to say, but it's always the one bad apple that seems to color people's impressions of that. As far as federal lands are concerned, I think it is critical that we work to provide access, but again, with working with landowners to make sure, because I guess here's an age-old problem, and that is, how do we make sure that people in Wyoming have access to public lands, don't have to apply for a permit to do so, and can have a relatively free experience on those public lands, as opposed to having to sign up for access and all that sort of thing. And my problem with public land agencies is that they often do not look at alternatives to anything other than direct access, and then when it gets overcrowded, sort of a permitting system. And I'd like to see, actually working with you, if there are alternatives that can provide other forms of management of people in the densities that sometimes occur. I look at the Bighorn Forest and I look at West Hensley, and I compare that to some of the stuff around Hyattville, and there's just there's really no comparison.
Okay. Currently, the only recreational use not allowed on cultivated state land is hunting and fishing. Would you, as governor and therefore president of the Board of Land Commissioners, entertain a rule to change that and allow limited use, say foot traffic only, on these lands?
Yeah, I'd be interested in looking at that. Absolutely. One of the big challenges we have between state trust lands and and federal lands is the impression that they're to be managed alike, and recreation, because there's no fee associated with it, doesn't usually enter to the stack of uses, and that's not a way of saying that we need to have fees. It is a way of saying if there's a compromise that we can come to, that would make sense to me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. The next question is from Derek Farmer with Wyoming Hunters and Anglers Alliance.
Thanks, Earl, for the introduction, and thanks, Mark, for being with us. As you know, Mark, public land use is critical to hunters and anglers. We're very concerned when parcels are sold or transferred that are used for our sports or for an access point to other public lands that we utilize. The question I have is this: during the sale and purchase or transfer of state lands, should the value of recreation on that land and adjacent lands be considered?
Well, having served on the SLIB now for a number, or on the State Board of Land Commissioners now for some time, I will say it does figure in. But as I mentioned in the previous answer, the problem is the stack of uses, recreation features down pretty far. However, I will say that I believe that one of the considerations that we constantly look at is, can we block lands? Can we provide additional public lands access? Can we do a better job of reducing the potential conflicts between private landowners and those who are, enjoying the lands on which they're recreating? And so with that in mind, if we want to codify that, I suppose that's a possibility. But the directive I would give is that we need to understand how these lands can increase access, can be more accessible to public recreation, are not landlocked. If we can find ways for access into those lands, so that we can work with landowners on all of those things, I'd like to see increase. It's something that I guess the other piece that we've talked about from time to time, both in SBC meetings and also during the primary, is, are there opportunities to block up state lands in a way that makes them more manageable and reduces the number of potential crossings that a person has to have, and so to some degree, I think it would be great if we could do that.
Wonderful. We thank you for considering land use and access when these pieces are for sale. Could you clarify on if you would be willing to make policy changes as the chairman of the State Land Board that would make those a permanent feature of this process? Here's
the way I look at it. I think it would be fine to have a public process to look at that, and I would support that. As far as just sort of definitively saying, as governor, this is something I'm going to do, I would defer to public input on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that works. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, and honestly, I would be happy to absolutely happy to discuss that.
Well, thank you, Derek, for that question. Our next question is from Larry Durante with the Wyoming Backcountry Horsemen. Larry?
Yeah, Mark. Say, this is going to piggyback on a couple of these other questions. There's several million acres of public lands in Wyoming that are not accessible to the general public without the adjacent landowner's permission, which you've kind of already hit on. Would you support the creation of a public access program in Wyoming, possibly similar to that the Game and Fish has and that Access Yes program? But this program would be dedicated to purchasing permanent access and easements from willing property owners, and thus enabling the public to have continual access to these public lands.
Larry, if I understand correctly, you're saying that you would look to purchase permanent easements and from willing buyers. I think I don't have any problem.
Yeah, would you help bring about a program in Wyoming like the Game and Fish has with that Access Yes to secure funding? And it could be from individual donations. People could donate like they do to the Access Yes program and donate
Sure.
$10 or whatever, and a fund builds up until they have some money and then buy some access.
Larry, I'd be happy to see what I could do on that. But the one area that I get concerned about for the average public land user, it's all public land, and so there really isn't necessarily a sensitivity to the fact that you could have adjacent landowners with adjacent agricultural operations that are next to each other, and if somebody leaves the gate open or somehow disrupts those operations, that's the area I'd love to work with you on, trying to inform people about how to access those lands and be respectful of the operations that are on them. And I say that because I'm familiar with a Hawaiian situation in which the lands were all put up for lease, and a number of ranches just completely disappeared as a result, because they suddenly broke up long-standing operations that not only provided wildlife habitat, but had extensive conservation operations on their lands, and as well as agricultural operations, and then those all sort of turned over relatively quickly. And to the degree that a person can be respectful of traditional ranches that are on those lands within the limits of whatever the regulations are that govern their grazing leases, I'd be happy to do that. Does that? And I guess I ask you, Larry, is that something that you think we can do?
Well, if somebody would start the program, I think you'd get a lot of people donating into it. Because right now, with that Access Yes, you can get into some lands, but only for hunting, like maybe elk, for instance, or hunting pheasant. You can't go in there and ride a bike. You can't go in there and take photographs. You can't do anything else. And just opening it up, just having an easement through there, if the willing landowner wants to give people access, let them go through for a fee and a permanent. Then, but somebody's going to have to start that. It would come from your office.
Well, and Larry, I understand that. I guess my point is, if somebody's riding a bicycle through my cows, that could be very disruptive to my cows, especially if they have dogs. And so my point is, how do we mitigate those kinds of things so that we don't end up with resistance? And it seems to me that would be a helpful place, to be able to try to work both of those operations.
Well, thank you, Larry, for that question. I think it's a question that's of great interest to a lot of sportsmen in the state. So it's a great question. The next question is from Jenny DeSaro with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition.
Thank you. So, Mark, you had mentioned collaboration earlier, so this is, I'd like if you could expand a little bit more on your thoughts about collaborative teams and task forces to address Wyoming's natural resource challenges.
Let me just ask for a little clarification.
I guess you had mentioned working in collaboration, so I guess can you talk a little bit more about what your thoughts are around collaboration, how you would have it set up, and who, why, that kind of thing? How you use it as a tool?
Well, and what comes to mind is that you have various RMPs coming up. You have the Bridger-Teton Forest Plan coming up relatively soon. Building a stakeholder process, or perhaps tying into the stakeholder process that's already envisioned in the forest planning effort. I think that is one aspect of it. When we're talking about access to public lands and the things that Larry and I were discussing about, conflicting uses and how to mitigate so that one use doesn't completely ruin the other use, or vice versa. I think those are processes that we can build on pretty much a task by task basis, i.e. If we want to work on putting together funding to buy access to public lands, that's relatively simple in terms of educating the people that are going to use those lands with the access that's there, and respecting the other users. that are there, that may be something that we want to, again, get stakeholders and be able to get local people on the ground to work through that process. Having gone through a number of those processes in my time, I think it's important to keep them relatively small with people who are well connected to the general public. And I think that because smaller groups tend to be able to come to decisions a little quicker and a little more crisply and cleanly. And I think of the Powder Tongue Basin Advisory Group, which was supposed to look at the water resources in the Powder Tongue area, compare that to the Bear River. Powder Tongue had an enormously large group, and we never really got much done, and there was a lot of bureaucratic leadership, whereas it seems to me the Bear River had much more stakeholder leadership. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but my point would be identifying stakeholders, making sure those stakeholders had responsibility to a larger audience, and then being able to facilitate those discussions, kind of on a task-by-task basis.
Great. I have one follow-up on that, Mark. Would you commit to appointing conservation organizations to collaborative teams?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Next question is from Aaron Bannon with the National Outdoor Leadership School. Aaron?
Great. Thank you, Earl. And thank you, Mark, for taking this time to talk with us. So my question is in regards to a decision made by the DEQ back in 2016 to do a categorical downgrade of small streams across Wyoming from primary contact recreation to secondary contact recreation. What this did was increase significantly the threshold of contamination from fecal coliform, E. coli, and other contaminants before management was required of these streams. This, of course, downloads and undermines the value, or downgrades and undermines the value of those who would use these streams for recreation, backcountry uses, like a lot of Knoll students. And I am interested if your administration, potentially, would be willing to take a second look at the DEQ's downgrade and think about ways to better protect the state's water quality resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to look at it on a second look basis. I think the Environmental Quality Act was relatively clear, and I think that the Environmental Quality Council was meant to be an independent board. I think it's been a lot of sideboards have been put around it of late, and I worry about that. So, kind of on a broad scope of those kinds of issues, I would like to be convinced for myself that those were the right things to do. I'm not sure in every case they were.
Thanks for answering that. In the case of this water quality downgrade, previous to that, if you wanted to downgrade a stream, you would sort of nominate it to be moved from primary to secondary regulation. And now with this blanket downgrade, the burden of proof has been shifted to the recreationists, right? The recreators, I guess. And each stream we want to upgrade, we have to do individual analysis on each.
Right, and that's to my thinking, that's a little bit the flavor of what has happened over the last 8 years or so. Has been more of a movement in that direction, and I don't think that the nomination process was terribly onerous, but we are where we are. But I am willing, and I'd like to understand more of the rationale behind that. As you know, a lot of that occurred after I was no longer on the Environmental Quality Council.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, great. I'd be happy to follow up with you and talk more about it, but I appreciate you having it on your radar.
Sure.
Thank you, Aaron. Our next question is from Steph Kessler with the Wyoming Outdoor Council, and I think she has a question relating to migration corridors.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Earl, and thanks again, Mark, for joining us. I have a kind of two-part question. There can be a variety of threats to big game migration corridors, including subdivisions, wind farms, and oil and gas development. Are you familiar with the recent 2017 research regarding the long-term impacts of oil and gas development to mule deer migrations?
Marginally familiar with it, yes.
Okay. At the last Wyoming Game and Fish Commission, the Game and Fish Department stated that it is their desire that no drilling infrastructure be located in the Red Desert to Hoback mule deer migration corridor. Do you support this goal?
Steph, John Talbot and I, not John, Scott Talbot and I have discussed that, I think there has to be protection of those migration corridors, but I think to the degree that we can, and that's really why I talked about what the spacing requirements were and the opportunities to improve technology for drilling and the footprints that are associated with that. And as you, I'm sure, are no doubt aware, there were some miscalculations in how they handled that. I don't think that means 3.86 rigs per section is right or whatever. But in any event, I would support protecting those corridors. Categorically, I think we need to look at those and review them carefully. I think the Game and Fish has only identified one corridor now. They have two more that are nearing identification and several more that are still a bit amorphous. And in the same sense as trying to do too much and having backlash, I'd like to see us work towards solutions. And I believe that we can arrive at some solutions that do protect those corridors. But I'm much more concerned about stopovers and basically some of those features to make sure that we make sure that the corridors actually function. So bottlenecks and stopovers, I think, are incredibly critical. So, Steph, unless you know more than I do, it does appear to me that the Game and Fish and the oil and gas industry are working to try to find some solutions to this.
I guess what I would say is that everybody agrees, yeah, we should protect these corridors, but the real debate is how. How do we do that? And I think there's a lot of work still to be done to get to some common understanding for that.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. These were only really tracked with Arthur Middleton's work, relatively recent, and that's actually some research that Jenny and I helped to support. So I feel it's very critical that we do that. I guess the reason why I'm being a little waffly about this is I have not seen a map with definitive corridor lines on it at this point, and I would like to work much more carefully on the ground to understand the dimension of what that is and find the solutions that work. I think there are compromises that can be reached that do protect those corridors, and I think the quicker we can identify them, the quicker, I mean, I'm sure that creates the battleground, but the quicker that we can identify ways to solve the problems that are attendant to that. But the corridors have to be protected.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you, Steph. That was our last scripted question, but we have a little bit of time left. Does anybody have any other questions, or perhaps a follow-up to the previous questions?
Can I ask my bonding question?
Sure.
Okay, Mark, do you support the current bonding requirements?
Yourself, please.
This is Larry up in Sheridan, Durante. Do you support the current bonding requirements, the financial limits for oil and gas development in Wyoming? If you believe they're adequate, why? Or if you don't think they're adequate, what would you do to fix this problem?
Larry, I'd have to revisit that and look very carefully. They clearly were not adequate. Under full bed methane, and as you know, I took a significant amount of heat because of that, and so did state lands and others. But I know they've made some changes to that process. They've looked at some alternate ways of handling adequate bonding. I haven't been to the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission for some time, so I'm just not really up to speed to say definitively whether they're adequate or not now. I will say that I would tend to want to make sure that they are far more appropriate for the needs that are being considered.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe one more question, if anybody has one.
Yeah, this is Sally Palmer, the Wyoming Interfaith Network, and I know you have to juggle a lot of different interests, but I was wondering what you might say, Mark, about the bill that Liz Cheney introduced. There's two clauses of that you may be familiar with. One is removal of BLM and Forest Service wilderness study areas, and the other was Section 3 is wilderness study characteristic areas. So her bill that she's introducing in the House of Representatives is to remove those areas, which would affect Wyoming profoundly. Yeah.
Well, I'm aware of the bill, and when I answered this question before, you're aware that I'm a Republican running on a Republican side. But I did also point out, and I feel very strongly about this, that the appropriate way to handle those areas is through the public lands process that is currently underway. And so I believe strongly that local government, local control should preempt national efforts on that respect.
Can I jump in with a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
Okay, at the local kind of WPLI level,
right,
we have observed in several counties that hundreds of the public will weigh in on one side, and one individual landowner will rattle the cage and be strong enough to kind of turn all of the decision-making in that one individual's favor. Is that the kind of local control or input that you are endorsing?
Well, I think that process aligned with three different approaches, and our land was incorporated in one of them. I did not interfere in any respect with that, but two people that are in my employ served on the Johnson County North Fork deal, and I didn't speak to that in any respect, but I think what we ended up with were processes that are wobbling through, trying to find a solution. And as you point out, strong personalities can rattle the cages. But that's hopefully one reason why there is yet another review that comes from the county commission, and yet another review that comes at the governor's level. And it does seem to me that you have to find the best available use or the best available option, and hopefully you have enough traps that you run in that process that people feel like they have. I mean, not everybody's going to be satisfied. There just isn't that potential in all cases. But you hopefully have enough of a public process that you arrive at a conclusion. I can tell you that, personally, I'm a little disappointed in how some of those processes have worked. So.
Well, thanks for that frankness, Mark. And I actually wasn't even thinking about Johnson County. I can certainly say we've seen that in Fremont County and in Carvin County just on Monday in a recent meeting. So it's pretty widespread, I guess. Yeah.
Well, and these are very difficult decisions. They really are, and certainly the potential uses we had in the 1970s when, a lot of those lands were being considered are very different now. And the potential, I think probably some of the agricultural uses haven't changed that much, but, we have a lot more motorized access. We have a lot more mechanized access. And just a lot more pressure on those lands, and so the issues probably are more exacerbated than they used to be.
All right, I think it's about time to wrap things up here. Mark, as you can see, we're a diverse group, deeply committed to keeping public lands in public hands, and if you're elected governor, we look forward to working with you. Do you have any closing comments?
Well, sure, and I really want to thank everyone for the difficult questions that were asked, and I would say that those are exactly the kinds of issues that I would look forward to working with all of you on. I've worked on many of those issues since the 1970s, and my interest is to make sure that Wyoming stays a beautiful and wonderful place to raise your kids, a place that you can go and enjoy the outdoors, that you can do that without having to line up and get a permit and go stand shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other people. I know we have all of those pressures. I'd love to find a way to keep Wyoming as free and wonderful as the place we all grew up in. And so I would look forward to working with you on those issues. And as we try to balance the issues of energy development on any scale with our public lands, I also look forward to working with you and finding the kinds of solutions that benefit the state and benefit our children going forward. So thank you very much for the call. Thank you for your very, very good questions. And I do look forward to further conversation.
And thank you for your interest in our public lands. And thanks, everybody, for attending the call and for asking these great questions. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Earl.
Thanks, Earl.
Thanks.